Welcome to Power Players by Origis, critical thinking to deliver the promise of clean energy.
Welcome to Power Players. My name is Janice Loppe, and I'm the Director of Sustainability for Origis Energy. Our guest today is Dr. Charles Sims. Dr. Sims is the TVA Distinguished Professor of Energy and Environmental Public Policy at the University of Tennessee Baker School of Public Policy and Public Affairs. Dr. Sims, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Janice. Thank you for having me. Thrilled to have this conversation.
I am too. We've got an exciting topic to cover. So recently, TVA partnered with the Baker School to publish a pathway study, which was identifying strategies for the Tennessee Valley to achieve a net zero economy. Before we get into the findings of the pathway study, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your relationship with the Valley and how you came to know TVA and develop this partnership with them?
Sure. So I'm the director for the Center for Energy, Transportation, and Environmental Policy here at the Baker School. I have been here for about 11 years now. Came here from Utah, where I was a professor at Utah State University. But I also have two degrees from the University of Tennessee and was born and raised in Knoxville. So very familiar with TVA and the Valley as a whole, and sort of what goes on here in Tennessee, especially on the energy front and things. My research over the years has been on things as varied as endangered species to natural gas, nuclear, and some of the things we're going to talk about today. So growing up here in the Valley was a great, you saw lots of environmental problems, but over the years, you've seen lots of instances where sort of practical policies have been applied to come in and try to fix them. And I think that growing up here and seeing those things was sort of what motivated me to study environmental economics and energy economics, to try to be able to take that same type of practical approach to some of the challenges that we face.
So about TVA, can you tell me a little bit about this relationship that you had with TVA and how they came to be sort of connected with the Baker School?
Yeah, so when I arrived at UT in 2013, we had a relationship with TVA that was more focused on hosting events and outreach and talking about energy issues, but not really doing any of the research that might be around some of those questions. So when I came in, I sort of wanted to change that direction and have more of a research focus to what we did here at the Baker School. So we started to develop a relationship with TVA on the research side, talking to people that were doing research, trying to get a feel for what they were interested in and the challenges that they faced. And one of the things that kept coming up was this recognition among TVA that they were having a harder and harder time predicting what their electricity demand would look like in the future. And that had rippling effects on all of their long-term planning. It's obviously really hard to decide if you want to make a big investment in a nuclear reactor or a wind farm if you can't predict what the demand for that electricity is going to be. So over time, we had conversations about what was causing that. Was this just an anomaly? Was this an issue with the models they were using? And slowly what we realized is that it was changes in consumer adoption of certain types of behaviors. It was adoption of rooftop PV systems. It was adoption of programmable thermostats. It was adoption of electric vehicles in certain markets. These were things that TVA had not traditionally paid a lot of attention to. And not that they were ignoring them, but they were sort of using statistical models to forecast what that adoption might look like in the future. So we started talking about the ways that economists would think about adoption of different technologies and how it's different and how it can model some of the interesting behavioral aspects of why people adopt stuff when it makes no economic sense, or why they don't adopt it, even though it might look like it would pay them huge dividends if they did. And so that was really what started it off, was helping them think through a little bit about how customer adoption was affecting their electricity projections, and trying to help insert economics into that particular problem to help them with their long-term planning.
Okay. So you made this shift from the fascinating world of understanding consumer behavior and demand planning into the fascinating world of understanding decarbonization and projecting decarbonization for the future, which is, those are kind of different topics. Demand planning and decarbonization are very different. So how did that come to happen? How did that transition in talking with TVA about their consumer behaviors to talking with them about decarbonization pathways?
Yeah, so the realization that we started to arrive at is that a lot of the technologies that were being adopted that was throwing a monkey wrench in all of TVA's planning were technologies that were being adopted, at least in part, because they were thought to be reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So rooftop solar systems, people are adopting those for financial reasons, but there's also some notion that at least a little part of that decision making was driven by concerns about the environment. And you could say the same for electric vehicles, and it kind of goes on and on. And so you realize that most of these technologies that we had been studying over the years were motivated in part by concerns about greenhouse gases and decarbonization plans in the long run. We then started to recognize that there were lots of quote unquote adoption decisions that were not necessarily end use customers like we had been thinking about it, but they were adoption decisions in the sense that they were changes in building codes, for instance, that you can think of as a local government is essentially adopting a new efficiency standard for buildings that go in. And so from an economic standpoint, it's not terribly different to think of an individual adopting an EV or a state government adopting new energy efficiency standards. There's cost, there's benefits, there's risks involved. And so we could take a lot of the same toolkit that we use to think about customer adoption of EVs and rooftop solar and think about adoption of new regulations or new standards that would improve energy efficiency in buildings or other land use decisions that had impacts on decarbonization. And at that point, we realized that really what Valley Pathways is sort of a stitching together of all these different adoption behaviors. And so once we started to realize that, we realized that there was a need to sort of coordinate all these decisions. Growing up in the Tennessee Valley, we have been sort of accustomed to thinking about decarbonization as being TVA's responsibility, and we're waiting on TVA to do it. And when you think about the other sectors of the economy, it comes down to adoption of different technologies and adoptions of different standards. And if we're not careful and we don't coordinate those things, we can get ourselves into trouble. So part of that was to help with coordinating those efforts on adoption that were going on that we saw from a TVA side, but then saw that it would be useful to kind of coordinate those to get decarbonization in other sectors of the economy outside of electricity generation.
So you shifted the conversation from just being TVA's responsibility from the perception of it's TVA's responsibility for decarbonization to it's really a broader set of stakeholders. And so one of the things that's really unique and really groundbreaking about the study, the pathway study, is that it involved this collaborative set of stakeholders, really broad set of stakeholders with a lot of different, I imagine they were bringing a lot of different viewpoints and opinions to the table that had to be kind of coordinated and organized. Can you tell me a little bit about that stakeholder process, how you selected the stakeholders and what it was like working with them and some of the learnings from that experience?
Yeah, no, that was the heart of this entire project is really the stakeholders, because we can go through and use sophisticated models and we can generate predictions and things, but there's been lots of that done over the years, and not a lot of has come of it because these recommendations and goals were not informed by a wide variety of stakeholders. So that was, we recognized early on, going to be key. We initially started by identifying a lot of stakeholders that had interacted with TVA on their integrated resource planning in the past. We started there because a lot of those folks sort of understood some of the issues that were going on already, and so it wouldn't be as steep a learning curve. But then we went through and we looked for places where there might have been gaps in that stakeholder group. And so, as I said, this is sort of economy-wide decarbonization for all sectors that might be emitting greenhouse gases. And so there were gaps in the stakeholder group that we identified where we had places that we needed some more stakeholders. So we reached out and talked to folks. We then kind of ended up doing what I'd call a snowball effect, where certain stakeholders would say, oh, well, you should talk to this group and bring them in because they're doing some interesting stuff on decarb. And so once we explained to people that this stakeholder group was not necessarily brought together to provide feedback to TVA, it was being put together to develop plans for themselves. People were much lots of new stakeholders started to pop up that might not have otherwise engaged. And so that was how it started as we built out that, and we're still building out to this day. I think people ask us all the time, is your stakeholder group maxed out? And it's like, we're never maxed out because we're developing plans for stakeholder groups. So if a new stakeholder group pops up, we want to talk to them about what types of plans they might need help with. But to your point, there were lots of opinions and lots of perceptions from day one. And we knew that was going to happen. And so one of the things that we wanted to achieve early on was consensus. It's really hard when you bring together that many different stakeholders to reach consensus on anything. But what we wanted to kind of achieve consensus on was a kind of core set of facts that we could build from. And so we intentionally chose some modeling frameworks that were intentionally transparent, so that we didn't have to make too many assumptions and we didn't have to have too many complexities added into the model, because we wanted people to understand where it was coming from and we wanted people to understand the data. Once we did that, the other thing that we really wanted to highlight was that there's several different paths to get to net zero. Each stakeholder group sort of showed up with their own idea of what the preferred path to net zero carbon emissions would look like, which is natural to do because it's a complicated problem. And when you're faced with a complicated problem, you tend to think there's only one way to solve this problem. But one of the things that we had wanted to make clear to them is there's several different ways to get there. Just because I don't agree with your pathway doesn't necessarily mean that I'm against a net zero goal. And so once we got everyone on board that, okay, look, we're all here, we're talking about net zero, we're bought into the idea of net zero, but we all might not agree on the same way to get there, and that's not a bad thing. That was sort of a turning point for the stakeholder group to really start digging in and stop defending their position, but try to start understanding other positions from other stakeholders that were in that group.
So you mentioned the word consensus, and one of the things that I noticed in going through the pathway study was that you had reached a consensus on this definition of net zero. So net zero is just a complicated concept. And the study has got this really simple and elegant definition of net zero that's not tied to any external definition that I could find with any of the nonprofits out there, with decarbonization plans. So you kind of created your own definition. Can you just talk a little bit about how that definition came to be? I mean, I just see that as being sort of an important point in the study that you achieve consensus on that.
Yeah, I'd say less that we created a new definition and more that we just didn't get into the nitty-gritty of the definition. I think it's a very common sense notion, right? We just want there to be we want the carbon being pulled out of the atmosphere to be greater than the carbon that's going in, right? And so it was a very easy concept to get around, and it was a very easy definition to get behind. Every time you set a very specific definition, there's an incentive for different groups to game the system by crafting a definition that suits their needs. And so the more that we spent time trying to hammer in details on that definition, the more we were spinning our wheels. And so part of it was just people checking out entirely. They were like, I don't even want to engage with this discussion around the technical details of what net zero is. Others realizing that if they could get this specific definition, it would make their lives easier, or it makes someone else's life harder. And so there was a lot of gaming of the definition that came up along the way. And so we wanted to just say, let's keep it simple. We don't want the definition to sort of derail the entire pathway or the entire trip that we're about to go on. And so that was, I think a lot of people would say that we punted on a lot of details. So for instance, scope emissions came up a lot. And so our definition says that we're net zero within the boundaries of the TVA service area. We had lots of discussions about scope emissions and the degree to which they go outside the boundary and things like this, but we could not come to a consensus about how to include those into that net zero definition. But again, I felt it was, and I think we all felt as a stakeholder group, that it was more important to make progress instead of letting those types of questions derail the process from day one.
Wonderful. That's such a nice thought. Just take more carbon out than you're putting in. It distills it down to what everybody can really understand. So one of the things about this study is you started this by doing, because in order to decarbonize, obviously, we all know you've got to measure where you're at. So you've got to pick a year, create a baseline, put a stake in the ground and say, okay, here's the point at which we're at, and we're going to try and decarbonize from that point. So you had to do a greenhouse gas inventory, and you had to do a profile of your emissions. Now, having just done a greenhouse gas inventory with Origis, I know how complicated that process is, and we just did it for a company. You did it for an entire geographic area for the whole valley. I'm just overwhelmed by the complexity of that. That's a mammoth task. So can you just talk a little bit about that process and how you took something that is so complicated and were able to process it in a very efficient time frame?
Yeah, like you said, the goal was to get something done to sync up with the timing of TVA's integrated resource plan. I think from day one, we recognized that the real benefit of this project was if it could sync up with TVA's resource planning decisions. They sort of feed off of each other in a lot of ways. And so we were a bit under the gun to make sure that we could produce these initial results in a timely manner that was going to coincide with TVA's resource plan that is scheduled to be released later this year. So recognizing that, we set about to kind of collect data from different sectors. So I should point out that there's a very real difference between doing this type of study for an economy, a regional economy, and a company, or even an industry. With a company, you have lots of data about the technical details of your processes and your supply chains and things like this that you can feed into those. When you're doing the regional analysis, you need less depth but more breadth. And so we needed a high level of understanding from a bunch of different sectors of the economy rather than a deep dive into any one. Which helps in a lot of ways. You can do breadth really relatively quickly if you know who to talk to and you know where to go get the data. The data is usually there at a pretty high level. So we really relied on our stakeholder groups to tell us what data do you feel like we need to know and we need to look at to get a better handle on greenhouse gas emissions within your industry or within your community or whatever it may have been. And they were very helpful in sort of identifying those data sources that we may have missed or we may not have understood. At that level, we were able to do a pretty high-level overview of the greenhouse gas emissions in each of those sectors just because we have the help of the stakeholders from each of those sectors of the economy. Now, one of the things that people ask all the time about next steps, I think the next steps for this are to take what is right now a very high-level regional greenhouse gas emissions accounting and downscale that a bit, either to a local community or to a city or to an industry or even to a company. And to your point, that's where things will get a little more complicated because there is a lot of details that go into those types of analyses that we didn't get too involved with when we were thinking more about the region as a whole. So yes, it is very difficult, but it's difficult in a lot of different ways, I guess, than it would be to do a greenhouse gas inventory for a company.
So you completed this inventory, came up with a base year, used 2019, which I thought was a great idea because it took out the noise of the COVID. So you came up with a base year, and then you projected these different scenarios out in the future. And you came up with some interesting findings from those projections. Can you tell us a little bit about what some of the key insights were?
Of the projections from the pathways?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So we looked at, once we sort of accounted for where we currently were, which was eye-opening for a lot of people. I think there were the accounting sort of revealed that that electricity generation was not the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the valley, which would not have been true a decade ago. And so I think that was sort of eye-opening for a lot of people that, oh yeah, TVA has reduced their greenhouse gas emissions quite a bit over the past decade. The next biggest sector of emissions were from transportation. So that's been a persistently large source of greenhouse gas emissions for a long time. It hasn't changed very much. We've seen improvements in greenhouse gas emissions in some of the other sectors, such as the building and the residential and commercial and industrial sectors. The transportation has been persistently around 30 to 35% of our greenhouse gas emissions, and that's not uncommon for the rest of the United States either. One of the things that came up in the stakeholder group that was sort of eye-opening was people's perceptions of what was the low-hanging fruit. Where should we start? Lots of people had pinpointed transportation, but others had really pinpointed the residential energy demand. And when you looked at the residential component of it, it looks small if you're just looking at the emissions that are not due to electricity generation. But when you factor in the electricity generation and you realize that part of all the electricity TVA generates is going to supply households with power, the residential sector looks bigger. It's in the 40 to 45% range of emissions. So there were lots of discussions around which one was the biggest sector, where should we start, right? If you were focused on transportation, you were really interested in questions around electric vehicle adoption. If you thought that the residential sector was the largest source and the one you wanted to focus on, then you started thinking about things like building efficiency, or regional planning that was changing how buildings were built and where they were located and things like this. So that conversation sort of kicked off what we talked about in terms of our future projections or where we might be. And so we modeled what we call 3 pillars of decarbonization. One was electrification. So this was a scenario where we said, what if we just electrified everything we possibly could in the valley? Another was focusing on resilient communities. And so the resilient communities idea is basically just, could we redesign where we live and where we work, redesign our communities as a whole in a way that would use less power. So not necessarily switching the fuels that we use, but just use less energy in general. So this could be building efficiency, but it could also be living closer to where we work. So we shorten our commute times and lower the vehicles miles traveled and the emissions that come to that transportation sector. And then we modeled another scenario that was what we called low carbon fuels. And so this was a recognition that electrification and changing the way we live and the buildings we live in is only going to get us so far, that there's certain sectors of the economy where electrification is just not an option. And we're thinking here particularly about heavy duty vehicles and airplanes and things like this. Lots of emissions out of there, but it's not reasonable we're going to be able to electrify those in the near future. And so we considered a scenario where there was a breakthrough in things like hydrogen or fusion technology or biofuels, for instance, and that might come in and help out in those sectors. So we modeled those out. We found that if we projected into the future with each one of those pathways out to 2050, the biggest emissions reduction came from trying to electrify everything. And this is consistent with what you hear from a lot of folks, is that we want to clean up the electricity generation and then we want to try to electrify everything. The biggest emissions that we saw there were certainly in that scenario. The smallest number of emissions that we had came from that resilient community scenario. So it got us down to about a 70% emissions reduction, which is in the ballpark of where we think we would need to get to be net zero, but it still had the highest greenhouse gas emissions of the other two scenarios. But the thing that was very interesting was that even though each of these achieved at least a 70% reduction in emissions, they all affected different sectors of the economy differently. And so some plans saw big decreases in emissions from transportation, and other plans saw big decreases in emissions from the industrial sector or the residential sector. And so that, if you remember, I was talking about each stakeholder sort of had their own perception about what the right path is. Part of it had to do with the idea that we're not on the path to net zero. We're not drawing down all sectors of the economy evenly. Some paths are going to have a big impact in certain sectors and then a small impact in others. So that really drove home the point to people that yes, there are multiple ways that we can achieve net zero here. And there are several different perceptions on which one of these is best or worst. A lot of it comes down to which sector is going to see the biggest emissions reductions and where it's not, right? We then ran a fourth scenario that said, what if all of these things happen at the same time? So it's not unlikely or it's not likely that you're just going to see one of these things happen and the others don't happen at all. And you saw some slight improvement, but it's sort of this idea of low-hanging fruit, right? If you put three of these pathways together, they don't generate 3 times the emissions reduction. So we saw slight improvements, but not the big improvements by putting them all together that a lot of people had thought.
So even with putting all 3 of them together, it still kind of equaled what accelerated electrification would equal.
Yeah, I want to say it got you a few extra percentage point reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, but not much. So this led us to start to decide that the most obvious no regret strategy was to try to electrify the transportation sector. That electrification got a big reduction in emissions, and it's the technology that seemed closest to widespread adoption. Maybe not in the next 5 years, but certainly in the next 10 years or so. But yeah, once we put all of them together, you didn't get a huge reduction, but you were still within the range that we would have expected to get the Valley economy to net zero. So I think the key take home is that all of those pathways had the potential to get us to net zero. It really just depends on which sector of the economy was going to be doing a larger percentage of that reduction.
So the transportation sector comes out as the one that seems like the most likely candidate for no regrets. And obviously, to drive that behavior, there's going to have to be some policy changes, some consumer behavior changes to make that happen. So can you talk a little bit about the outcome of where you think policy needs to shift in the Valley area to enable that?
Yeah, so I mean, this is getting into sort of my personal beliefs more than it was the stakeholders, but certainly the EV adoption. We have several folks here at the Baker School that are studying this exact question, but they'll all tell you that it's a chicken and egg problem, right? EV adoption is hindered by the fact that we don't have enough charging infrastructure rolled out. But the reason we don't have enough charging infrastructure rolled out is because we don't have enough demand, because we don't have EV purchases. So there is that interesting chicken and egg problem that I think everybody understands. I think the other interesting thing that we have learned from work here at the Baker School is that the people enjoy knowing that they have access to a lot of charging locations, but they don't tend to use them. And so on a day-to-day basis, people drive from their home to work, maybe to the grocery store and back home again. And so the vast majority of the charging that goes on is at their home. But it's like anything else. We like to know that something's there when we need it. And so there's a big notion that a lot of the chargers won't necessarily get used a lot, but we need to know they're there before we'll feel comfortable purchasing an electric vehicle. Which brings up a lot of questions about who should be funding these electric chargers that might not actually be making money. They're just there to make us feel a little more secure. So there's been lots of questions here around who should be funding that. Lots of questions that folks have been trying to study about whether this should be public versus private, and how you should support that private industry that may be coming in to supply the charging without creating, a monopoly and preserving competition in that sector and things like this. I think the one thing that most people will agree on is that at least the people that I've talked to in this area, is that more federal funding is needed to try to support the rollout of the charging infrastructure. There's a lot of thought among economists that policies around subsidizing EV adoption are not terribly equitable. Usually the people that take advantage of those subsidies are the ones that can afford a very expensive Tesla vehicle. And so the money would be potentially have better equity implications if we spent some federal dollars on trying to support the EV infrastructure rollout. But then once you get everyone to agree on that, how to spend the money starts to become another point of debate. And I think there's several different schools of thought around how we should go about doing that, whether it should be private that does this, whether it should be a public-private partnership, whether we should leave it to the Teslas of the world to do it. But I think that on that front, I think that's where most of the policy energy seems to be going around EV adoption.
So just to step back on a kind of a closing note on policy, I wanted to get your thoughts on your policy philosophy. So from this study, one of the things that's really cool and apparent about it is that decarbonization it's local and it's regional in nature, and we're all going to have to make decisions that are good for the particular area that we're located in. But on the other hand, behavior is driven by policy. So what's the best lever here to pull? Is it federal policy, or is it the city-state policy? Like, when it comes to the war on decarbonization, where do you start first from a policy front?
Yeah, so this is a question I think that economists and political scientists have been trying to solve for years and years and years now.
And you have the answer, right?
I got the answer for you right here, exactly. There's a whole field of research around this called federalism, and it's this notion that, exactly like you said, what's the preferred level of policy to address an issue? Is it at the federal, state, or local level? And what it all boils down to is that there's trade-offs, so there's pros and cons of being at each individual level. For environmental problems in particular, like decarbonization and climate change, the federal government is advantageous because they provide, or they set up policies that can account for spillovers across different jurisdictions. And so oftentimes what has happened in the past is if a state sets up a policy or a city sets up a policy, what that tends to do is just shift the pollution to other places in the country, right? So if California has very aggressive greenhouse gas policies, then maybe all of that polluting industry shifts to a neighboring state. Federal policy can help us sort of coordinate that to make sure that those types of spillovers don't sort of undermine what others are doing. There's this notion of free riders that we talk about a lot in economics. So this notion that if I'm Tennessee, I may just free ride on the decarbonization initiatives that California engages in, because decarbonization is costly. But I personally don't care if we reduce greenhouse gas emissions in California or we reduce them in Tennessee. They're what we kind of call global pollutants. So regardless of where they come from, it has the same effect on me. So that unique aspect of climate change creates this issue of free riders, and so federal policy can help address the free riders issue too. Now, the downside to federal policy is that it tends to be one size fits all. And so as much as they try, usually there is lots of aspects to the policy that are not tailored to local economic conditions or local preferences or even local physical environment in an area. And so the local approach benefits from being able to tailor the policy to those local factors. Usually get more buy-in from local constituents when you design the policy that way. But the downside there, of course, is that it generates the spillovers and it creates this patchwork of different environmental regulations, which a lot of people have pointed out is problematic in a lot of ways. And so if you think of a company trying to design a product, but you have 50 different standards that you have to meet for that product, depending on where it's going to be sold. If it's going to be sold in Oklahoma versus California, it makes things a little tricky for companies. And so that's another downside of having every city or every state go it alone. But I think really the benefits of the localized approach are pretty strong. We've seen lots more buy-in from policies that are being developed at the local level, and this is something that sort of motivated our notion of trying to generate pathways and plans that were more tailored to these local communities when we were doing our Valley Pathways study. We recognize there's no silver bullet, and if the plan that worked for Nashville was marched into a city-county building in a rural county in Tennessee, it's probably not going to go very far. So there's a lot of pros and a lot of benefits to doing that localized approach. Now, where the federal government probably comes in here is helping through federal investments. A lot of the things we're talking about with decarbonization, they are changes in human behavior, but there's also lots of investments in big infrastructure as well. And those investments in big infrastructure are hard for local economies to swallow. They're typically not being local governments are usually not being asked to make those big investments. Those are usually coming from state governments or federal governments who are funneling dollars for new road projects or new water infrastructure projects and things like this. So I think the role of government here is to help fund some of those big infrastructure changes and then leave it to the local governments to decide what is the best way to spend some of that money based on some of the local factors that only they really understand and know.
Yeah, that really makes sense. Well, Dr. Sims, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a super pleasure speaking with you. I really appreciate all of your insight.
Well, as you can tell, I love talking about this stuff, so I'm happy to come back and do it anytime.
Thank you so much. Dr. Sims, you are a power player.
Find more information on this topic and more insights on clean energy at origisenergy.com.